Welcome, everyone. It's Danny Dhaiphong. You're tuning in to another live stream. Today, we are going to go in depth, not just about Syria and the fallout, but also the larger geopolitical picture here as we move into a post-Assad, post-Syrian Arab Republic era, not only in West Asia, but the entire multipolar world. And who better to do that with in front of the show, a returning guest, Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. Brian, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yes. So everybody, as you come into this live stream, do hit that like button because that helps boost this stream in YouTube's algorithm. And as you do that, you can also go to the video description. You can find Brian's YouTube channel and all the places where you can support this work. So, Brian, I wanted to first throw out a question. I saw a theory by a gentleman named Alex Craner, who is an author, and I believe he's in the finance sector. He laid out a theory of trying to understand what happened in Syria from Russia's perspective. And what he said, and I find this to be partially true, but I want to hear your perspective, that Russia saw the writing on the wall with Syria and its downfall. And then when it did, it decided that it wasn't going to get itself into a quagmire, but it was going to allow NATO and the rest of the forces so keen on chopping up Syria into bits to have at it. And that would therefore be of some strategic advantage and use to Russia. What do you say about this theory, Brian?
I would say it's partially true. Russia realized that there was nothing that it could do about the collapse of Syria, and so they cut Syria loose. We have to understand that there are serious limits to what Russia, Iran, China, other nations in the multipolar world, they have serious limitations to what they can do. We were just talking before the show, if we wouldn't be seeing this struggle between the US and the multipolar world. If the multipolar world had unlimited power, we would already be living in that multipolar world. There is this struggle taking place with these devastating wars, destroying entire regions because there are serious limits to the multipolar world. It is growing stronger, but it still has serious limits. Each nation that makes it up has limits. People take for granted the amount of power the US has accumulated over the decades, and it was riding on European imperialism, which persisted for centuries. And so we have to understand that there's a certain momentum to what the US is doing. There is a struggle because the limitations of the emerging multipolar world. Russia saw its limitations, recognized them, and reacted to them. To a certain extent, so did Iran. We have to understand this collapse of Syria in that context. Now, I've gone back to the RAND Corporation's 2019 document titled Extending Russia. And if you go to its table of contents, the table of contents talks about the different areas that they are using to apply pressure on Russia. First and foremost, Ukraine. Next on the list was Syria. And then Belarus, the Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and also Central Asia. These were the areas that the US was focusing on. And they're applying pressure along all of these fronts. And so Russia, with its limited resources, needs to prioritize. They're obviously prioritizing in Ukraine. The last thing I will say about this is that we can see that the conflict in Ukraine is a war of attrition and that Russia has the advantage, clearly has the advantage. But where does that leave Russia along these other fronts? And what Syria demonstrates to us is that the margins are very thin, at least for Syria. When Russia is looking at the bigger picture, they also need to make sure they have enough in reserve for contingencies like Syria. And obviously, they do not have enough resources to go around and ensure all of these fronts are secured. So they have to pick and choose which ones they hold on to and which ones they need to cut loose if the conflict expands beyond their control and beyond their ability to deal with it. People have to be realistic and recognize that there are limits to what Russia, China, Iran, and the rest of the multipolar world can do at this point.
Yeah, and it appears to me, too, that while everyone right now is saying that Syria is this major victory that almost seems permanent in the sense that it has done so much harm to the axis of resistance to Iran. But a lot of people are also saying to Russia, because for Russia, not only does it have military and naval assets in Syria, but it was a sort of bulwark, one of the few states left in the region that is not just sympathetic to Russia, but sees Russia as a key partner and ally. But at the same time, Brian, I wanted to ask you about the consequences of the fall of Syria, not only for Russia and the ISIS resistance, but if you could talk about what could be the consequences long term. We see right now Israel on the move. They're occupying, they're taking territory, Turkey as well. The United States will have some say in this. But what they've done is they've unleashed chaos and hell, it seems like. And I'm curious about your assessment of how Russia might perceive how that would affect the collective West and NATO in the medium and long term, because Russia, in my opinion, is thinking more along those lines.
Yeah, so it's already turning into another Libya. So we saw the U.S. NATO, well, not proxy war, but actual military intervention in Libya in 2011, the collapse of the government. And as soon as the collapse took place, the Western media did their victory lap, and then they pretended Libya didn't exist, because as a nation state, Libya no longer really exists as a functioning nation state. Factions are fighting to this very day. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2011, Russia was in no position to intervene and save Libya. We heard these same arguments. For people that remember, back in 2011, people condemned Russia for not intervening and saving Libya. They literally had no possible way of doing that. They don't have the ability to project military power in that manner, especially if NATO is right there preparing to get involved. And they're just flying across the Mediterranean to strike at Libya. So we can see how that has transformed. Libya is a failed state. Both sides are still waging basically a proxy war inside Libya, and that is what we're going to see inside Syria. These terrorists are the exact same organizations and extremists that the U.S. used to overthrow Libya. As a matter of fact, they literally took them from Libya and transplanted them into Syria via Turkey from 2011 onward. And what they did with Libya was turn it into a NATO terrorist breeding ground. They exported weapons and terrorists across the entire region, North Africa, and then going further south into the African continent. And they used that as a pretext for many years to justify the presence of not just the US military, but the French military. This is how they justified a continuous military presence across Africa. But we could see what that has transformed into. We could see the inroads Russia and China are making across all of Africa, and nations literally evicting US French forces from their countries. And so there has been this pivot, and this is what people need to keep in mind. This is long term. You suffer a loss, and the collapse of Syria is undoubtedly a loss. There's no other way to spin it. It is a serious loss, but you have to think long term. It is one battle amid a much wider war. You have to keep focused on that. If you allow one little loss, and it's little relative to what is going on all around the globe, and you allow that to dishearten you, to shake your focus and your determination, that is self-destructive. People need to get past that, and they need to focus on, this is the reality, this is what happened, what can we do next? So we see Russia, China working on Africa, liberating Africa essentially from centuries of European domination. And the Middle East has also suffered under Western domination for decades, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so this struggle will continue, but it has to change, and it has to change recognizing reality and not kidding ourselves. We cannot kid ourselves about what is happening. We have to understand the real problem so we can devise real solutions.
One of the interesting moves that Russia also made almost at the same time after the fall of Bashar al-Assad was to, according to reports now, Belarus has not rejected these claims that Oreshnik missiles are now in Belarus that and can be used by Belarus. But Mr. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, also said, "Oh, we also have bigger nukes that are just as effective as the Oreshniks, if not more so." And so I'm curious about this move, Brian, in this context, because the fall of Syria and the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad is certainly part of this broader plan by NATO to try to set a trap for Russia. But Russia is now stationing some of the most powerful weapons in the world on NATO's doorstep. What do you say?
Yes, well, Belarus is one of the fronts the U.S. has concentrated on for years and years and years. As a matter of fact, this 2004 Guardian article that I always refer to, admitting that the U.S. was behind the chaos in Kiev back in 2004, the first major attempt to overthrow the Ukrainian government. Then they admitted that they also attempted regime change in Belarus, successfully in Georgia and Serbia. And so Belarus has been part of this conflict for years and years, and Russia is consolidating the defense of Belarus by doing this, by making it almost impossible for the US and its proxies in Europe to do to Belarus what they have just done to Syria and what they have done to Ukraine, precipitating this proxy war there, and what they had done in Georgia in 2003 and are attempting to do again right now as we speak. So that is why they're investing so heavily in Belarus. They do not want anything to happen to Belarus like what just happened in Syria. So they're doubling down. It's easier for them logistically. It's right there next to Russia, and it's important that they hold that. We've heard about NATO staging troops along the border with Belarus. There's all of these threats to overthrow the government in Belarus, using proxy groups to go into Belarus, just as Ukraine was pretending to do before they launched their incursion into Kursk. So these are all considerations people have to keep in mind when looking at what Russia is doing. They're not just waking up one day and deciding to do this. There is a real national security threat Belarus faces, and this is Russia shoring them up.
Indeed. And Brian, comment on a lot of people are talking about the existential threat of the fall of Syria and Bashar al-Assad to Russia in particular. And I do see these moves, as you said, as a way to fortify Belarus and really its own strategic sphere, not of really of influence, but it's of sovereignty, of being able to protect itself, because in many ways, people are looking at the fall of Syria as this road to Moscow, with the final aim being the overthrow of the Russian government. And so I wanted to ask you about this overall strategy by Russia. Like, how do you understand Russia's long-term significance of this? Because people are saying that Syria isn't Russia's responsibility. However, Russia was invited there to protect Syria's sovereignty at the request of the Syrian government. Now the situation is different, and I'm curious about, how do you see this existential threat to Russia with the fall of Syria, and how Russia will continue to move forward?
Yeah, it absolutely is a threat to Russia itself, an existential threat to Russia itself. And the whole reason Russia got involved in the first place is because if you look at the global map and you look at what the United States, NATO, Europe, all their allies have been doing for decades, is encircling and encroaching upon not just Russia, but also Iran and China. If you look at Eurasia, the collective West is attempting to surround all of it. They target all of these nations along the periphery of Russia, Iran, and China. They attempt to destabilize them, politically capture them, turn them into a united front against these three, I would say, pillars of the multipolar world. And so what Russia was doing in Syria was trying to hold the line there. Now that Syria has collapsed, the line has to fall back. The next big target is obviously Iran. These terrorists are going to be used to go into Iraq, into Lebanon, to consolidate control over Syria, and it's all aimed at Iran. What the collective West is doing, and this is, again, look at the big picture. They're going after Iran. If they can eliminate Iran, Now they've isolated Russia and China further. Their goal is to get rid of Russia next, to fully isolate China. This is called defeating an enemy in detail. You isolate different units from each other so they cannot cooperate, and you defeat each one in turn, defeating in detail. This is what the US is trying to do on a global scale against the multipolar world. Understanding it in that sense makes it very clear what is happening, why, and why Russia was involved in the first place. And understanding that Russia, China, Iran, they have to do everything in their power to prevent these nations from being politically captured and then turned against them, because they are ultimately next. It's a whole, this is not something the multipolar world can negotiate with the United States. They want dominion over the planet, and they will accept nothing less. And that's very clear. They're not, when they talk about freezing a conflict in Syria or Ukraine, it's just to buy time so that they can regroup and go at it even harder. As we just saw in Syria, the freeze was supposed to be moving towards some sort of resolution. Instead, it was just round two.
Yeah, and Russia must be looking at this very closely because it mirrors the Minsk Accords, the Astana Agreement does in terms of now the results. And so, I'm curious, Brian, do you see Russia, given this roadmap that you just laid out as the overall strategic objective of the unipolar world led by the United States and its allies against Russia moving to China, do you see Russia stepping in militarily further, not necessarily in Syria, because I do believe that is going to be a very difficult situation for all parties involved in the medium and long term. Short term, we're going to see Israel throwing up the flag and Turkey pounding its chest, but these fighters are, we've seen it over and over again, what happens with these so-called quote-unquote rebels, jihadists, the Takfiris, whatever you want to call them, Salafists. They're not, they roll by the beat of their own drum in the final analysis. But what I wanted to ask you is, given that Iraq is in the next road kind of path to Iran, do you think Russia will step in militarily if the situation ends up getting out of control and we see that path to Moscow, or at least the path to cut off Russia from West Asia, develop further?
It's difficult to tell. I think if Russia could, they would have stopped this all in Syria. And the reality is they couldn't. This is, when we're trying to assess what Russia has at its disposal, there's no way to tell because we don't have access to the Kremlin and their understanding of where their strengths and weaknesses honestly lie. But watching Syria collapse tells us that if this were to continue, if this were to then move into Iraq, what is Russia going to be able to do in Iraq that it wasn't able to do in Syria? It wasn't able to do it in Syria. How is it going to do it in Iraq? And the same problem is presented to Iran. So what I think needs to be done, especially for Iran, they need to consolidate what they have and reassess how they're going to approach this. It honestly doesn't look good. People have to understand, again, Iran has certain strengths. Its ballistic missile arsenal is a huge strength. It poses a real threat to the US and its regional proxies, including Israel, especially Israel. But at the end of the day, it itself is not all powerful. If you've been following this struggle for years and years, you will see that Iran itself, inside its own borders, struggles to maintain stability and order. They've been targeted with sanctions for decades, US-sponsored terrorism for decades. Another document that I always go back to is the 2009 Brookings Institution Which Path to Persia document. In here, they lay out all of these options that not only they could use, but that they have used. We know that they've used against Iran. And so Iran is facing the exact same problem Russia is, as laid out in the Rand Corporation 2019 paper. And China also is facing the exact same problem. It's not just Syria that Iran, Russia, and China were looking at. It's all of these areas, all along their periphery, from Europe all the way to East Asia. So we have to keep that in mind. Russia, obviously, its top priority is Ukraine and along its borders, because it has US-sponsored conflict brewing all along its borders. It has to maintain peace and stability within its borders. We know the US is targeting Russia internally. So I honestly, I don't know what else they can do in the Middle East. They have their 2 bases there. I don't know for how long. I'm not going to make predictions about that. It could change at any moment. They could have been made some promise by Turkey, Israel, and the US, and then the promise gets pulled out from under them again. We don't know. But I think they're focusing first and foremost on Ukraine and now protecting their borders.
Well, my last question on this particular topic, back to this whole trap theory, is I'm curious about the fact that there may be some calculations here by some of the forces, the powers, the unipolarists seeking to carve up Syria, that Donald Trump is coming in and he's looking to get America out, supposedly, rhetorically, out of Syria. So let's just grab everything we can. And then we are kind of the forces allied with the US. I'm thinking Turkey and Israel here, that will just be allowed to exist because, you know, they can be key US allies. But on the other hand, I'm curious about Russia's perspective here, because for Russia, I think they understand quite well that Syria and really the entirety of the Middle East is a non-negotiable arena for US power projection. So I actually don't agree. I'm curious on what you think. I would say that Russia's probably looking at this like, well, the United States is going to have to pool resources into what's going to happen into Syria. And I'm curious of whether they're considering that might give them some reprieve regarding Ukraine, or even just the overall strategy of moving toward Russia at an accelerated pace.
Well, the problem is what Russia sought to do in Syria, what Iran, what China sought to do in Syria was to build. And the United States, what it sought to do is burn the entire region down. Danny, you remember back October 7th last year, and I warned everybody that that operation was a rolling out the red carpet for Israel to first flatten Gaza and then precipitate a wider regional conflict, to create a permissive environment to basically burn the region to the ground, to reverse all the progress that had been made, repairing relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, getting Syria accepted back into the Arab League. All of these steps toward real progress were targeted by that. And from that point until now, we can see what the final result is. Well, it's not really the final result, because they plan on burning everything down. And so for the United States, yes, they're going to invest resources into the Middle East, but it's always easier to burn everything down than to build it up. This is the advantage the US has, in addition to the huge momentum behind their primacy over the globe. They have the advantage of just wanting to burn. They're not trying to compete with Russia and China and Iran and building things up. Their answer to the Belt and Road Initiative is to just arm terrorists and have them attack the infrastructure and literally burn it down. So this is the problem. This is the problem that the multipolar world faces. They're trying to build something large globally, and the US wants to destroy it. And they're very good at destroying things. That's the one thing the United States these days is still good at, is just burning everything down. So that is the unfortunate part. And I think they have the advantage in that sense. A lot of people in the region, and again, I warned about this last year, people are so blinded by ideology, by hatred, by emotions. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't feel emotions, but you cannot allow your emotions to, I would say, distort your ability to analyze. And you should not allow your emotions to drive your decision-making. A lot of people just wanted to see Israel hurt. They wanted to believe Israel was being drawn into a trap, when in reality, the trap was being laid for peace and stability in the region. And now it has been sprung, and we see the results. I hope people learn from this. I provided the same warning in 2011 during the US-engineered Arab Spring. People still, to this day, cope with that obvious realization that the US used it to burn North Africa and the Middle East to the ground. They want to believe that, well, the US co-opted it. No, they engineered it years in advance. If you just look at the evidence, ignore your emotions, and look at the evidence, stop trying to rationalize and do real analysis, you will see that that was engineered by the US. And they're using the same trap over and over again. They used hatred of the US and Israel as a trap back during the Arab Spring. They portrayed it as an anti-US, anti-Israeli movement. And so people reflexively supported it, when in reality it was a US engineered regional regime change operation. That's why it was successful. And they've done it again, and they will continue doing it until people stop allowing themselves to be drawn into the trap.
Yeah, I want to return to the Middle East in a bit, Brian, but first, I did want to talk more about these latest moves by Russia just in the last day or so, and this involves Ukraine as well. So, in recent period, we've seen, of course, Russia launch. The last time we spoke, Russia hadn't launched the Oreshnik yet, and they did, and they hit Ukraine, and there's been a lot of conversation about that. But they're going to launch more. That is what the U.S. is saying. That's what Intel is saying. That's what Russia has said. And we have the Ukraine attacking Russia with ATACMS still, hitting airfields inside of Russia. They just hit Taganrog with ATACMS. And so this could happen at any moment. Now, I wanted to ask you your assessment of the significance of this missile, help people understand what it is, and how it's important in this moment, because it seems like what's happening is there's a struggle with deterrence and defending territory and territorial integrity. So talk about whether this is a game changer, how it is, and what it's all about.
It's a game changer only if it actually changes the game. It has the potential to do so. It's an intermediate range ballistic missile, and it serves as a non-nuclear strategic deterrence. And so have we gotten a final answer on the impact of this missile on the target that it struck the first time it was used? And I think that's up in the air. I think if it didn't cause any damage, the collective West would have been very happy to share all of that information with the public, and they haven't. So that suggests to me it possibly did work. If they use it again and the result is very obvious, I think it will establish a non-nuclear strategic deterrence. But that is the point. We have to wait and see what it actually does to change the game. And also, I would say that one single type of weapon is not going to be a game changer. The conflict in Ukraine is being won by Russia because it is a war of attrition, and Russia's military industrial output is greater than the collective West's. And they're right there on the border with Ukraine, and they're able to move their military and the resources to support it right into this territory. For the collective West, they're trying to do this collectively, which creates problems all in and of itself. The United States needs to move everything from one side of the planet to the other to aid the Ukrainian government and military. And so this is the main reason why Russia has the advantage in Ukraine. The Oreshnik and other weapon systems that Russia is developing are enhancing this advantage that Russia has. But I don't think people should overplay it, but they should also not dismiss the implications of this. Russia's military industrial capacity in and of itself serves as a deterrence. It has made the collective West hesitate in to aggressively getting more involved in Ukraine. They're already intervening in Ukraine. NATO troops are already in Ukraine, doing many roles there to support Ukraine. They had been since 2014. They're hesitating becoming more involved, specifically because they cannot outproduce Russia. They will have the same problems if they more openly intervene in Ukraine that the Ukrainian military itself has. Not enough artillery, not enough air defenses, and they will suffer from the consequences of that. The Oreshnik enhances that. We just need to wait and see on the ground just how much it enhances that.
Yeah, well, tell us what you know, because I know that you do a lot of research into the capabilities of weapons, and I know that we're kind of looking at analysis from both sides of this conflict when they talk about the Oreshnik. But in terms of what you know about it, what are its capabilities? How impactful could it be if it were to be deployed in its, in this escalation ladder? Because Russia has said that it is a game changer in the sense that it is as powerful, maybe even more technologically advanced and effective than a tactical nuclear weapon. And that means it could essentially eradicate the need for nuclear weapons altogether. But your assessment, Brian?
This is actually a concept that has been around for a long time. The collective West is worried that China will develop intercontinental ballistic missiles with the same capability. Instead of putting nuclear warheads on them, well, they will have intercontinental ballistic missiles that have nuclear warheads, but they will also have conventional armed intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the whole point is you can hit any target anywhere on Earth, and you can cause significant damage because it's especially an ICBM is going up into almost into space, and then it's coming down at such speeds that the kinetic energy alone is going to cause severe devastation. There were concepts, and who knows who may have been trying to implement this or may have already implemented this by putting large tungsten rods up into orbit and then just using kinetic energy to drop it on a target and again have the same impact as a nuclear weapon but without the nuclear fallout. So there's this concept that's been around for a long time. Russia now has a weapon system that it says can achieve this, an intermediate range missile, but basically the same concept of just using kinetic energy. And of course you could put different types of warheads on the projectiles themselves, short of using nuclear weapons. And I think it's going to be a trial and error because this really hasn't been done before. And they will continue, just like they have been doing throughout the entire special military operation. They make changes depending on the results when and if necessary. So I think, again, that's what we're looking at. And if it can just wipe out, say, an air base with one missile or a couple of these missiles, that would be a game changer because, again, it would be basically wiping out an entire area, not just a target in an area, without needing to use nuclear weapons. It would be a game changer. And the reason why is not necessarily because of the missile itself. The West is capable of making missiles like this if they really wanted to. It's, again, Russia's military industrial capacity, China's military industrial capacity. If it came down to an exchange with these missiles, who would have more of these missiles? Who would have more air and missile defense systems to defend against them? And the answer is Russia and China would. They would have the advantage.
Well, then doesn't this make this continued policy of allowing Ukraine to launch ATACMS into Russian territory just that much more of a folly? Because not only does it risk Russia going up the escalation ladder with these Oreshniks and pounding maybe one day Kiev, maybe one day beyond Kiev, but also it leaves NATO itself and the United States in particular in a particularly vulnerable position.
Yes, absolutely. But the U.S. and its proxies this is their end game. They're going for it. They understand that the world is transitioning. There's going to be a point of no return where it irreversibly transitions from a U.S. dominated world to a multipolar world. Once that happens, there's no going back. So they're doing everything they can think of to try to stop this, including short of having a better alternative, because they don't. They're just going to burn everything down. Again, the advantage kind of lies with them because they just want to destroy everything and disrupt everything and ruin everybody's peace, stability, and prosperity. That is their goal, while the multipolar world is trying to create peace, stability, and prosperity. And so even though, yes, Russia has these advantages and they're winning this proxy war in Ukraine, the collective West they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about the long-term implications, the fact that if Russia demonstrates military dominance in in Ukraine. They're not really thinking about the implications of that long term because they're so obsessed in the short term of disrupting multipolarism, even if it's just done by just turning the entire world into conflict, chaos, and eventually ashes.
Yeah, it's just kind of astounding how Russia has these weapons now, has used them, will use them again, inevitably, given the US's continued policy of allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles into Russian territory. And yet, exactly as you said, there is no second thought about, hey, maybe we should reverse this policy at all. And we saw, Brian, Donald Trump meet with Macron and Zelensky. There's been a lot of talk about pulling out of the Ukraine conflict. The money is going to stop. But it seems like regardless, because I have a lot of suspicions about that even happening regardless of all of the things that lead up to it. But the U.S. Political class and military class, these warmongers, have done everything they can to prevent that. Even today, or in the last few days, I should say, preparing for turning the key, as Janet Yellen did, giving $20 billion to Ukraine and celebrating it like it's the biggest achievement of her career. I mean, there's just one move after another, giving $20 billion. Oh, I forgot to mention that that's off the interest of the $300 billion stolen from Russia. So your comments on how this is going to continue to play out on all fronts against Russia with respect to the Ukraine conflict.
Because again, we have to remember, it's not just the proxy war in Ukraine. It is this encirclement and encroachment by the US on Russia, Iran, and China along multiple fronts. And so what the United States is doing with the ATACMS, for example, they're just trying to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia, to extend Russia as much as possible in Ukraine, to then weaken it along these other fronts where it hopes maybe it can collapse Russian positions, which it just did in Syria. So this is a kind of a wake-up call against complacency. Many people think multipolarism is a done deal. It isn't. It has to be fought for until it is a reality, and the threat posed by U.S. primacy is removed entirely. And that is what the multipolar world needs to remember. You're not going to convince the collective West to play nice. They're not going to negotiate with you. If they say they are, it's just to buy time so that they can get what they want in the long term. You have to create the conditions on the ground globally that leave the United States with only one choice left, and that is to work together with the multipolar world rather than attempt to impose itself upon the multipolar world. That is the reality. It's like a chess game. Your opponent is not obliged to be charitable to you in any sense at all. You need to set up the board in a way to compel them to move in the direction you want them to move. They have to remember that. I'm sure that they know that, but for the rest of us watching on or participating in it to the degree that we can, we have to remember that is the reality of this. The West is not going to negotiate. They're not going to come to their senses. They believe that they're inherently superior and that they should have primacy over the globe, period.
Yeah, but we have, Brian, a lot of people who watch this show, a lot of people who follow politics right now. They believe that Donald Trump is going to help facilitate the pullout of the United States from Ukraine and its involvement in Ukraine. However, we just had, Trump, Macron, Zelensky meet. We had Putin and Orban talk. There's some theories being bandied about that this could be the kind of architecture for future negotiations. What do you think?
No, I completely forgot to answer that part of the question, Danny. No, Donald Trump played a central role in precipitating the proxy war in Ukraine in the first place. He's a politician. He tells you what you want to hear to get your support, and then he does whatever he feels like once he's in office. That's what he did the first time he was in office. That is what he's openly, obviously doing this time coming into office. Again, the conflict is ending in Russia's favor because of Russia, not because of President-elect Donald Trump and his plan to pull out. If the U.S. pulls out, which I don't think that they will, but if they pull out, it's only because they realize, well, this is a lost cause. One thing that we can take away from what happened in Syria is that your army doesn't need to take the whole country territorially. You need to just hollow out the army enough to where it collapses, and then by default, you get the entire country. This is what the collective West is worried is going to happen in Ukraine. They know that. They say this just as a point of propaganda. Oh, look how slow the Russians are advancing. Russia isn't trying to take territory. They're taking territory as part of a war of attrition. They're trying to hollow out the Ukrainian military and deplete the collective West's ability to support them, which takes huge amounts of resources, which is why Russia cannot be everywhere all the time, including someplace like Syria. But once the Ukrainian army collapses, you may see a situation very similar to what happened in Syria, which is why the collective West right now is talking about a freeze and peacekeepers. It's actually just creating a buffer zone, just like they did in Syria, to freeze the conflict so they could reorganize, rearm, and relaunch hostilities on terms more favorable to them. So that is where we are.
Right.
That's why people have to be very careful about, again, complacency. Who Russia has won in Ukraine. Well, the NATO intervention that is almost inevitably going to happen, because they will not just allow Ukraine to collapse like Syria did. That is going to create unprecedented probability of a direct conflict between NATO and Russia.
Yeah, and I think back to this earlier point too, Brian, about Russia can't be everywhere. And so within Syria, the Syrian Arab army was obviously just completely in tatters and decimated. And Russia obviously had to have either known this or found this out quite rudely as things. I mean, Russia was conducting airstrikes early on in the Aleppo offensive, at least. And those quickly ended. But when you think about it, when I look at this, a lot of people criticize Russia. They criticize Russia about its involvement in Syria, not involved enough. But when I think, well, if the army in Syria has collapsed, Russia going into Syria essentially means you are going to get into a quagmire fighting not just the rebels, quote unquote, HTS and the terrorists. You're going to be fighting the forces supporting them and trying to exploit their advance, which is what we are seeing now in Syria. And the same in Ukraine, this whole idea of, well, running roughshod over Ukraine and just, wiping your hands with it and you're done, drop a bunch of Oreshniks on Ukraine and it's all good. No, because then you are in open confrontation with NATO, because the United States and NATO are that just apps unhinged, like you said it. They have this desire to bring this to an end. They are not going to allow Ukraine to be demolished by Russia's superior military strength, which means, of course, the alarm would be sounded, and we don't know how bad that could get. So, Brian, comment on this overall assessment that I just laid out.
No, you brought up a lot of really good points, Danny. First of all, a lot of people are saying the Syrian Arab army didn't fight. They did fight. They were decisively defeated because they were hollowed out, and because they themselves did not have the resources necessary, but also Russia and Iran didn't have the resources available to give them, because they're tied up everywhere else. So actually, as early as October, there were attempts. They understood that this offensive was coming, and they attempted to disrupt it through airstrikes. And the very very NATO-esque element of this was that the offensive was then linked to the airstrikes as if it was a retaliation for the airstrikes. But obviously, an offensive of this scale took a year or more to prepare. So they were obviously preparing this ahead of time. Russia, Iranian, Syrian intelligence detected it, and by October, they were trying to disrupt it. But it didn't work. And so at that point, I'm almost certain that Iran, Syria, Russia, knowing that this offensive was coming, it was unlikely they would be able to stop it. They had two contingencies. The first contingency was to do everything they could to stop it, just in case they could. They could disrupt it, break the momentum. The second contingency was just divesting from Syria, because there's no point, just like you said, Danny, there's no point involving yourself in a quagmire, and doubling down on a battle amid a much more serious and wider war. So that's what they did. It's clear that's what they did. People saw the Syrian Arab army withdrawing. They knew there was nothing they could do. The nature of the fighting, the Syrian Arab army existed to defend against forces from 2011 to 2019, not forces that exist today in 2024 with attack drones, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance drones that could see where the Syrian army was, their positions, attack them with these drones that they had no defenses against. And but they would be forced to leave their positions, because as the drones are attacking them, the terrorists are rushing forward in huge numbers, well-trained, armed. Again, a year or more, this training obviously and preparations were taking place. And Turkey is not suffering from the crippling economic sanctions. Syria is. They didn't have the ability to move weapons and ammunition in on the scale that these terrorists were in Turkey. And again, it's not just Turkey, it's NATO. Turkey is in NATO. The US was obviously involved. And so by the time the Syrian Arab army withdrew to fallback positions, the same process started all over again. They went from Aleppo to Hama, from Hama to Homs, and then the military just dissolved, because there's what else could you do except in an act of futility, fight to the death. Now you're dead. All of your equipment is gone. There were reports of large numbers of Syrian soldiers and their equipment moving into Iraq. So if that is true, that is actually a good thing, because if you're thinking long term, it's better for these forces with all their experience and whatever is left of any equipment worth saving. It's better that is saved for a later time. When you've obviously lost, it makes no sense to stand your ground and fight to the death. Look at Ukraine. That's what they're doing. And it has hollowed them out even more. So people, again, you have to think strategically and in the big picture. Nobody with any sense of humanity wanted to see the Syrian nation destroyed as it is. And the Western media is pretending like this is a great thing, but that's only because they are deliberately ignoring the sectarian, religious, and political massacre that is taking place in the streets all across Syria right now, just like they did after the fall of Libya. And they're not talking about, well, they did admit that the rebels are actually literally U.S. State Department listed foreign terrorist organizations, without a doubt. And they're on that list for a reason. That's the one thing the U.S., Russia, China, Iran all agree on, is that they're terrorists, without a doubt. So we have to keep all of this in mind. Nobody wanted to see this happen, but it has happened because of real constraints and the reality of this much larger conflict taking place.
Yeah, no, all good points. And for Russia and of course the multipolar world that we've been speaking about, it's also an understanding that this isn't it, right? Like this is a huge monumental moment, but even those details that you just remarked about, where Syrian Arab army forces retreated into Iraq after the defeat, I've also been seeing videos going around of Syrian Arab army soldiers saying that they're going to continue to fight for Syria moving forward, even without Bashar al-Assad, because there was fighting. This was such a mixed bag because there's so few casualties, right? Like the Syrian army did retreat far back. It kept retreating, then it was defeated. And there a lot of reports about commanders and generals giving orders not to fight. And so here you do have potentially thousands of people who were in that army now displaced. The same happened in Libya. There was images of massive numbers of people who fought on the side of Gaddafi and the Jamahiriya. They left. They had to go because they lost and there was no way for them to win. So it doesn't mean it's over, but it does mean that we have this situation where leaders of the multipolar world like Russia must consider the right now And it seems like, given what we see on the battlefield in Ukraine, that Russia has decided that right now they need to be protecting their sovereignty. And I'm curious about your thoughts about what's happening on the battlefield, given these developments.
No, absolutely. If Russia loses the overall war, there's nothing they can do for Syria. Or if they held on to Syria, but at the cost of losing this much larger war taking place, then eventually Syria would have collapsed also, because Russia itself would have collapsed. So they have to think about this in terms of priorities. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, if the rise of China reaches critical mass and it irreversibly surpasses the collective West, all of these disasters that the West created can be revisited, and things can be done to salvage what has happened. As people have to keep remembering that they obviously should not give up because this happened, but you have to admit a defeat when it happens, and you have to think about the big picture, what needs to be done next, what is the priority. And again, that is a decision that has to be based on facts, logic, and reason, not anger, despair, depression. And so that's very important. A lot of people wonder where was China? I've seen a lot of people blaming China for Syria collapsing. I even saw one comment say, they literally said, China could send 40,000 troops to Syria. They have 1.4 billion people. They wouldn't even know they were gone. The thing is, nobody understands it ordinarily. Normal people don't understand what it takes to move 40,000 troops from one side of the world to the other. They see the U.S. do it so effortlessly, and they take for granted the fact that the U.S. built those capabilities up over decades, and they have a global spanning network of bases specifically to facilitate that. China does not. And they don't have the capability to do that even if they wanted to. So there's that aspect. People say, why didn't they do more economically? To economically support Syria, you need stability, and there was never any real stability in Syria. So these were all problems. And obviously, China has other things it needs to worry about, such as the entire U.S. military staging all along their shores in Asia, in the Asia Pacific region for a war. The U.S. openly says it's going to be fighting with China in the next couple of years. Danny, I'm sorry, there was another question you asked me. I can't remember what it was.
No, it was just about, I think it was just about the battlefield, how things are
in
going
Ukraine,
there,
on the
because
ground
there
in
is,
Ukraine.
because at the same time as we're talking about Syria, this massive defeat, Russia is taking part in this war of attrition. And, you know, all of this criticism toward the multipolar world, really, when we think about what Russia had to do in Syria versus what it's doing in Ukraine, I think you see an overall strategic posture, which is smart and actually what you need to do to ensure that this world continues to move forward. But if you could give some details about what's happening on the battlefield, as well as what you think about that.
Well, because Russia has prioritized Ukraine and has its resources focused there, and on whatever other contingency they have prioritized above Syria. We can see, if you just even look at pro-Ukrainian live maps, you can see Russia continues to advance. Every single day, they've basically overrun Chasiv Yar, which was a huge Ukrainian stronghold outside Bakhmut, which Russia also took. This salient stretching out to Pokrovsk. They're now encircling Pokrovsk, which is what I said was going to happen. The Western media said, Russian forces stopped at Pokrovsk. Ukraine stopped them. But in reality, that is what Russia had done. Every single city that it has taken, it reaches it, and it stops, it besieged the city, and then it envelops it. And then it takes the city. So that is what's happening to Pokrovsk. Again, the Western media admits this is a central hub for Ukraine in holding the Donbas region. And so that is what Russia is doing. They're incrementally taking away these very strategic positions, these heavily fortified positions Ukraine has a hard time recreating as they fall back. And as they do that, they are gutting the Ukrainian military. We can see how desperate the situation is. You can see Kiev arguing with the US and the rest of NATO about mobilizing 18-year-olds, which is an admission that they can claim all day that they're killing 10 times more Russians than Ukrainians. Hardly any Ukrainians have perished. But when they're talking about mobilizing 18-year-olds, that tells you that they are reaching their limits. So if Russia has its limits, and Syria is a symptom of that, so does NATO and their Ukrainian proxies. They have their limits, and they've obviously reached them. And so what NATO is now preparing for is the inevitable collapse of the Ukrainian military and what they can do to create a buffer zone inside Ukraine. And there is this real fear that Russia will not hesitate to strike NATO forces when they enter into Ukraine. That's the big question. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows if that is going to happen or not. That is the calculation that the US and NATO are trying to make right now. And so that's what's going on the ground in Ukraine. This is basically the same thing that has always been going on. It's just accelerating because of the nature of a war of attrition.
Yeah. And, I want to, you mentioned earlier this kind of blame game, blaming everybody for what's happening in Syria or even Ukraine. Just what we were talking about, the war of attrition, strategic posture, this understanding that it's about grinding down the Ukrainian military so it's hollowed out and eventually falls like a house of cards at some point in the future. There is, whenever there's a historic, because when you think about Syria, you think about Ukraine, these are like historic moments. There is this tendency, I believe, in the collective West to begin to seek out instant gratification and want the forces of multipolarity to essentially commit suicide, to end their project on the basis that some kind of stronger response would lead to favorable results. Well, on the one hand, Brian, we have Russia with these advanced weapon systems like the Oreshniks, but the United States has nuclear weapons and are willing to use them. And you have China, which has this massive economy, incredibly successful. At the same time, it's both in a geographic position as well as in an economic position where it has responsibilities, not just to the Chinese people, but to these big, massive economic trade arrangements. People emphasize BRICS, but even something like the Belt and Road Initiative, you begin to use your defensive military capabilities for offensive purposes, and suddenly you are now orienting yourself in a completely different manner. So when it comes to this multipolar world, Brian, I want to get back to this blame game because I think people aren't understanding that how Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, how they move in this very difficult geopolitical environment actually is, in my opinion, a stroke of genius. Because we have to look at things from how they really are. What do you say?
Yes, absolutely. Again, that's a very good point. Thinking about China's actual responsibilities and the way they have to prioritize them, not the way they want to prioritize them, the way they absolutely have to prioritize them. And that they have an entirely different approach to the whole rise of China as a nation state and the way that they're doing it. And you're absolutely right. The collective West attempts repeatedly to provoke its adversaries. It constantly attempts to provoke Russia, Iran, and China. And the public, even the public supporting Russia, China, and Iran, demand instant revenge. They want revenge against all of these things. Again, October 7th and what Israel has done to Gaza placed upward pressure on the Iranian government, on Hezbollah, to do something. This was always designed to have them overextend themselves and then collapse themselves. And in a way, it kind of did work because Iran, people don't seem to get, Iran doesn't really support Hamas, not anywhere on the scale that it supports Hezbollah. And people don't understand why that is. It's because Hamas is cut from the same cloth as the forces that just took over Syria. That at one point they were literally shoulder to shoulder with those forces in Syria, fighting the Syrian government, the Iranian allies, the Russian allies, Hezbollah allies. People didn't get that, and they wanted revenge for Gaza, and it's understandable. It's a tragedy. It's a catastrophe. It's a crime against humanity. That is the whole point. A lot of what Israel does is very deliberate, to provoke emotions, to override reason and strategy. And I think to a certain extent, it has worked in the Middle East. Now, with China and Russia, it doesn't work as well. China and Russia are extremely patient. China more than anyone, because the United States literally has troops on Taiwan, which is internationally recognized as Chinese territory, and yet China has not done anything. By right, they could, but they haven't, because they're thinking long-term, they're thinking strategically. They have removed any desire for revenge or emotional satisfaction from the equation, and they're thinking of just what makes the most sense. Suffer short-term political humiliation and achieve long-term victory, or satisfy yourself now and collapse later. Russia did the exact same thing in Ukraine, the withdrawal from Kherson and Kharkov. A lot of people, we remember, Danny, people were furious, and the word treason was brought up a few times.
Right.
But in the long term, you can see how well that decision served Russia strategically, even in terms of just the conflict in Ukraine itself. And it was the same thing in Syria. Even when Russia intervened, there were attempts to precipitate a war between Russia and Turkey. Turkey literally shot down a Russian warplane and then ambushed the rescue team. They had some extremists assassinate the Russian ambassador in public, in broad daylight. So there were many attempts to provoke Russia, but Russia stayed the course. And making decisions based on this long-term desire for victory, that will be their revenge. That will be China's revenge, long-term victory, even if it means short-term political humiliation at the hands of the West.
Yeah, and in all intents and purposes, China does not care about the humiliation of like being perceived as being humiliated by Westerners, because I think what we are talking about is what Russia, what China, and we can add in Iran in there. Everyone's saying Iran is dead. Everything is dead now, right? Because Syria fell. Everyone is to blame. Everyone's a sellout. Iran sold Russia sold out. Iran sold out. This is the kind of childish thinking that goes on in the heads of people who are not thinking about the big picture here. But in my estimation, not only does China, nor does Russia care about Westerners, whether they believe this is some kind of humiliation, but they know better in terms of what the overall impact their policies are going to have for their respective countries first. And I do believe they think about the rest of the world, because there's some arguments that, China and Russia have to take care of themselves. But multipolarity and their adherence to it means that they're also concerned and curious and wanting to see the entire world, especially the global south, be lifted up out of abject poverty and the destruction and chaos that now we see in Syria. And then last thing before I kick it back to you, Brian, Syria. So this idea that, one, Russia didn't do enough militarily is ridiculous, because they literally were conducting airstrikes immediately when these forces invaded. But two, Russia is only going to follow a government that is functional in inviting them to conduct military operations, because Russia, as an adherent to multipolarity, is also an adherent to the UN Charter and to international law. And then this idea about China not helping Syria's reconstruction enough. What do people think sanctions are? Sanctions do not just affect the countries that are sanctioning it's not just Syria and the United States, Syria and the West. It's Syria in the entire world. Syria literally did not have a banking system. People were sitting in the dark in Damascus nearly 23 hours a day for large periods of the year, every year since 2019. That is a decimated economy. How does China rebuild that if Syria can't get what it needs from the world economy? You could say, well, China could just bypass. this is a lot bigger than just being able to jump over sanctions. China invited Syria to the Belt and Road Initiative. Syria accepted. There was a lot of work toward thinking about rebuilding. But if Syria can't rebuild, how can China rebuild Syria? And so this is the big problem I see, Brian, is that there's a lot of people wanting to reject the immensely positive and, to my estimation, genius moves by the leaders of the multipolar world and negate the fact that they are still fighting and still struggling with and still having to contend with the existing world order as it is, which is doing everything it can, led by the United States, to prevent them from doing all these things that people wish would get done. What do you have to say?
Oh, absolutely. This goes back to the what we were talking about at the beginning. We're talking about how if multipolarism was all powerful, we would already be living in a multipolar world. There would be no U.S. hegemony, but that's not the reality yet. There is this colossal struggle taking place globally. Everybody is part of it, whether they know it or not, whether they want to be or not. And you're absolutely right. China is looking at the big picture. If they bypass sanctions on Syria, if even that would have helped, which I don't think that it would have helped, because again, you cannot rebuild a nation economically if there's no stability, if there's no security. You cannot rebuild Syria. This was just a festering wound that just delayed the inevitable, essentially. That there was never really any sort of rebuilding that started. And we remember Dana Stroll of the US Department of Defense in 2019 bragging to the world publicly that the US is squatting on Syrian resources, the majority of Syria's resources, energy and food, to starve and freeze the Syrian people into submission, to keep Syria a pile of rubble. She even literally said the rest of the country is rubble. And that's the way they wanted to keep it. They wanted to block reconstruction. They wanted to perpetuate this crime against humanity that they were committing this entire time, and knowingly doing it. It wasn't like, oh, this was an accident. They meant to burn Syria to the ground. They meant to burn Libya to the ground. I warned people many times about how the Middle East is starting to pivot. The U.S. has no alternative vision for the Middle East. The way that they're going to stop it from pivoting is to just burn everything down so there's nothing left to pivot. That's what they're doing. And all the countries in the region need to be aware of that is their fate, even if they're a supposed ally of the United States. If ever they begin to pivot to follow their own best interests, and if that does not align with what Washington wants, they will be burned to the ground as well. So this is the problem, and this is what Russia, China, Iran, this is what they have to approach when they're solving this problem. They have to keep all of these factors in mind. And if China bypasses sanctions for Syria that are not even really going to help Syria, and that's going to open the door. I mean, the U.S. plans on isolating and completely destroying China. That's their end goal. That's not negotiable. That's what Washington wants. But China is trying to string it out for as long as possible. They understand that the status quo favors them. Running the time out favors them. And what the U.S. is doing, realizing this, is trying to destroy everything before time runs out. So it's a race. It's a race between China building faster than the U.S. can destroy it, the multipolar world building faster than the U.S. and its proxies can destroy it. You have to understand it in that sense, and then you can understand more clearly the decisions the multipolar world is making.
Yeah, even just in the last couple of years alone, Brian, China and Russia, what they've done, even in West Asia, to ensure that something like a Syria wouldn't happen, the intense negotiations, the attempts to bring normalization, to bring stability to the region, to bring opposing sides, Turkey and Syria together, China bringing together Palestinian resistance groups, bringing together Iran and Saudi Arabia. These two countries and the multipolar world as a whole, and we have to include Iran in there because a lot of people criticize Iran for not, just knocking out Israel with its missile capabilities. But at the same time, Iran has to live in the region, and Iran is also trying to be a part of this larger world and be a focal point of this multipolar world. And if you just are at complete armed conflict, a total war with Israel, then that project is completely ruined. And that project is already very much tenuous because of sanctions as well. It just so happens Iran has far more advantages than, let's say, a Syria in being able to bypass sanctions geographically and other factors. But the point is here, Brian, is that I think people right now, when they see something like Syria happen, they see an incredibly, and this is true, an incredibly devastating event that knocks the wind out of the sails of resistance to Israeli aggression, to U.S. aggression in the region. But also people are seeing this as, well, Syria's fallen, Iran's the next domino, definitely going to happen, Russia, and then China. It's all going to happen. And I just want to say people need to put on the brakes a bit and understand that we cannot negate the whole of history, even recent history, when one event occurs that is not favorable to the cause of multipolarity. Your reaction and your thoughts?
Absolutely. This is what I'm trying to impress upon people, is that this is just one single battle amid a much larger war. Just think about World War II. Think about the Soviet Union in World War II. What hope did the Soviets have in the beginning of the war when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union? What hope did they have when the Nazis were literally outside Moscow? Many people had very little hope. Many people gave up, but many more people did not. They did not give up, and they continued. They were looking at the big picture. They accepted temporary losses for a strategic and total victory in the end. Just look at a time lapse map of World War II, the Nazi Germany invasion into the Soviet Union. Look how far it went. And then look at how much territory the Soviet Union had to take back before eventually they reached Berlin. And so I'm not saying that just because it happened before in history, it's automatically going to happen again. That's the whole point. You cannot just give up because of one battle. You have to keep in mind the larger war. You have to continue fighting on. You cannot just give up because of one setback. This is advice for you in your daily life. You know, if you have one little setback and then you just give up everything, you're not going to achieve anything at all, ever. So you have to continue. You have to be persistent. Most people, the majority of successful people in life, are people who refused to give up. You see a lot of successful people and you just think, well, they've always been successful. You don't see the 10 years of eating ramen noodles on the floor that they went through before they became successful. And even that applies to me, myself, just in my very small journey. At one point, I was literally like paying for ramen noodles with coins, and I was writing articles anonymously. I wasn't getting compensated for them or anything. I was doing other work to get by. And it's just life is ups and downs. And now we're talking about geopolitics on a global scale. There's obviously going to be ups and downs. It's not a Hollywood movie. Everything isn't going to work out smoothly. And maybe things won't work out at all. That's why you have to fight even harder in real life than people imagine in fantasy or in fiction.
And it seems to me that what people are seeing with Russia and China in particular, now Iran. Iran is in a very vulnerable position right now, but their supreme leader has confidently said that not only will their resistance continue, but he believes resistance as a whole will continue. And first of all, I believe him because that's what history says. First of all, just because there are major setbacks, it doesn't mean everyone cowers and decides that they're done with fighting back, and they're just going to allow that Israeli boot or HTS boot or US boot to just sit on their necks. And we wouldn't really have a multipolar world. We wouldn't have the history that we do with regard to US failed wars, for example, if people were just like, yeah, let me just keep that boot there. But I think even in a broader respect, though, when it comes to the bigger powers like Russia and China, it's that they see setbacks not as some kind of emergency that has to be doused with water, but they see them as uh, moments that require a response that is in league with their longer term vision. And people are not always going to be happy with that, because it means making and taking steps that are seemingly on the surface not aggressive enough, or not enough to rectify a situation. But let's be honest, Syria was not a rectifiable situation. If it were, it wouldn't have fallen that fast. And I am not going to sit here and be like the Syrian government, because in my opinion, the Syrian government for so many years stood valiantly up to the empire and did everything it could. But it's quite clear that in the last few years, whatever it was, internal pressures, attempts at staging a coup, maybe they were successful. We have so many unanswered questions, but what we do know about Syria is that something internally was going on very wrong, and externally there was a lot of pressure that could very well have precipitated this. And so Russia and China are going to look at that and say, well, we need to continue on the path that we have laid forward, whether Syria exists as it did with Bashar al-Assad or whether it does not. Your comment.
No, not to reduce this to a board game, but if you think about a game of chess, you're not going to finish the game with all of your pieces. You have to sacrifice pieces. It's just the reality of the game. And in geopolitics, that is also a reality. Now, if you are losing these pieces after careful consideration of how you're actually going to win the overall game, then that makes sense, and it's not done in vain. And for the loss of Syria, it's not a time to beat your chest, and if you have hair, pull your hair out. It's a time for learning from whatever mistakes might have happened that led to this. It is a warning against complacency, and it is impetus to fight harder where you can, to accept where you cannot succeed, and to succeed where you can. That's the lesson learned there. And so just like in chess, if you're going to lose a piece, lose it for a reason, and think about the big picture, the overall victory you're trying to achieve. And a lot of people who play chess, when I was a small kid playing with my father, I would lose a piece, and then I was so upset about losing that piece that I would immediately try to get revenge, to take another piece. And usually that led me to fall into a trap. And so that's what people are warning about when they say, don't become emotional, don't react emotionally, think logically, rationally, think strategically, look at the big picture, think about what you're trying to do overall. That's how we have to approach this. And one thing I do want to put in here, it's not really directly related to your question, but
okay.
One thing I do think that Russia and China could do a lot more of is working on information space, securing information space as a 21st century national security domain. I see China presenting a very appealing alternative to US domination. The problem is the US is an expert at convincing people to work against their own best interests. So while China is offering the best, obviously the best deal, the best alternative, the US is able to convince them to not take it, to actually fight against it even. This is what they have done all across the Middle East. This is why you have people who think they're fighting against the US and Israel, actually getting arms and money and training from the US and Israel, laundered through their Arab allies in the region. That's why you see that happening, because the US still to this day, their super weapon is controlling global information space and infiltrating and taking over the information space of individual nations. I'm in Thailand right now. It is utterly monopolized by the US through the NED, which stands up media outlets that people trust, have no idea are even funded by the US government. They infiltrate the education system. They infiltrate the political system. If you infiltrate the education system, you have now taken over the pipeline that is creating future journalists, future politicians, future diplomats. future business owners, and all of these people are going to be aligned to Western interests at the expense of their own best interests. They won't even realize it, because that is the power of controlling information space. We like to think that every human being is rational and thinking things through, but most people don't even have time to do that. They look at whatever propaganda they're plugged into and they believe it. That's the unfortunate reality. So Russia and China have created a compelling alternative, but they need to understand the importance of information space in that, and in helping people pursue their best interests rather than work against them. Like, look at Ukraine. That is a country the United States has convinced to commit national suicide. Same with Georgia from 2003 to 2008, and now they're trying to do it again. How do they achieve that? Who's behind the protests in the streets in Georgia right now? The National Endowment for Democracy, directed and overseen and funded by the U.S. State Department, the corporate financier special interest in Wall Street that control everything that happens in Washington.
Yeah. I think, what's interesting about this is that this is all interconnected. So China's development model globally, hopefully, and this is not a rapid process, but hopefully can help accelerate the process for countries maybe in a weaker position than China to develop their own economic infrastructure, so they can have, because China's Great Firewall. Oh, Danny, why are you for censorship? Listen, China's Great Firewall is incredibly effective. Its ability to capture and reject and fight back and defend against infiltration of the highest order regarding misinformation is incredibly important when you're trying to avoid outcomes like what happened in Syria, what's happened in countries like Venezuela, where there is a lot of media controlled by oligarchs connected to the United States and NGOs, and they spread all kinds of misinformation so that people will support forces that are literally trying to destroy the country and them, but they'll support them because they believe they're pro-democracy or whatever the hell they're branding themselves as. So China's information ability to protect itself from misinformation from the collective West is incredibly valuable. Russia, because of sanctions, I believe, has seemingly been able to implement its own kind of model around this. But the ability to project that outward, one, I believe, hinges on other countries like Syria, for example, during Bashar al-Assad being open enough. Someone in the comments said, it made a good point. Well, Bashar al-Assad was moving toward the Arab League, looking to normalize, looking to be more involved there. Economic trade-offs between Iran and the Arab League, choosing between China and the Arab countries economically. Yes, all that is true. And at the same time, a country like Syria, a country like some of the smaller countries, Nicaragua and Eritrea, whatever we're talking about, they hopefully will see this and think, well, how can we cooperate with China to be able to emulate that kind of system? But it's going to be hard because we're talking about different levels of development and also different situations. A country like Russia and China, one of their biggest strengths is that they do have such a strong level of sovereignty that most countries just don't have right now, and that creates a lot of challenges. But it is such a good point that information, look at how information affected Syria, Brian. People were talking about social media itself spooking the Syrian Arab army. That should never happen. I mean, obviously there are bigger problems than just social media here at play, but if social media is showing this kind of just massively positive imagery of these fighters and how scary they are, how well equipped they are, then yeah, even if you do outnumber them, even if you had all the equipment, if you had everything going for you, you might be scared because guess what? Your country has already experienced what it's like to be overrun by these forces, and they do very bad things, and they're doing them right now in Syria.
Absolutely. Well, one point that I always try to make is that Russia and China help other nations defend the physical domains of national security: air, land, sea. They need to then just add information space as another domain that they aid nations in defending. And I don't mean coming in and doing it for them, but providing them the means to do it. A lot of countries, say here in Thailand, they don't even know where to begin. How do you make your own social media network? This is something China and Russia have done. They can export this as a means alongside tanks and warplanes and ships. They can export this beside those other implements of national security to help a nation create its own information space and show them how to protect it. Russia and China have very strong pipelines, educational pipelines that take young people and shape them into journalists, diplomats, politicians, business owners who work for the interests of Russia and China, not for the collective West. Here in Thailand, a lot of companies will hire, first and foremost, Thais who have went overseas to the collective West to get their degree, and they come back. These people unwittingly have an affinity for the collective West and their narratives, and they will block out alternatives, even if it's obviously true, but they will block it out, and they will work for Western interests at the expense of their own country's interests and sometimes even their own country's existence. And that is exactly how we remember how the conflicts in Syria and Libya began. It began as these fake street protests that were expanded using social media. The U.S. State Department, for years before the Arab Spring sprung, were training these agitators in the United States, equipping them, funding them to exploit social media to overthrow the respective countries. And how was that even possible? Because these countries are not even using their own social media platforms. They're using US-based social media platforms. At that time, it was Facebook and Twitter, which are literally working directly with the US State Department to do this. And so you have your own country, but your information space is completely controlled by the US. Everything that happens on it is determined by the US, not by you and the people in your country, but by Wall Street and Washington. And they can make the decision what information is promoted and who is just censored out of existence. This is what had happened to me before Twitter became X. I was literally censored off of Twitter because I was exposing US political interference here in Thailand. The Thai NGOs being funded by the US State Department work together with Facebook and Twitter. There's even an announcement that they published on Facebook's official website talking about how they work together with local NGOs to get me and other people censored. So this is serious. And I feel that if you do not have your information space protected, it's the exact same outcome as if you just left your borders wide open and allowed an enemy army to come in. In this case, you're allowing foreign interests to turn your own population against you and your country's best interests. And so even if you have a large conventional military, like say Thailand does, if they can convince the Thai people not to ever get into the tanks or to point the guns of the tanks in the wrong direction, the opposite direction, you still lose. So there has to be this evolution in thought. We're in the 21st century. We have to understand that national security domains have now expanded into information. The internet is not just something that you chat. You know, like in the early days, you just chat and you like buy some hoodies or something. Sure. It is how people get information. It is how people shape their understanding of the world and even their own identity. That is extremely powerful. That's perhaps the most powerful super weapon there is. We could talk about Oreshnik, intermediate range ballistic missiles, but the US still has the ultimate super weapon. And I believe it is imperative that this be changed, and it can be changed.
Yeah, those are all good points. And information war is just such a critical part of this overall puzzle. But Brian, I'm gonna give you one question from the audience as we get to the close to the end here. Let me ask you this question. Sparky asked a few. In the interest of time, I'll choose one from this viewer. And they say, Brian, does it look like Syria is Israel's cross to bear now? Is Israel spread too thin?
What people don't understand is that Israel is the original Ukraine. It is the Ukraine of the Middle East. The U.S. ultimately doesn't care what happens to Israel. They will use Israel down to the last Israeli soldier, the last Israeli citizen, to achieve what they want in the Middle East. So yes, Israel is spread dangerously thin. And there are a lot of contradictions within Israeli society. You see the protests. You saw how much the prime minister benefited from the October 7th attacks, because before that, there was huge divisions within the Israeli government. So the security crisis was the perfect pretext to unify the Israeli government, to quiet his opposition, to get everybody on board. And so, yes, they're spread too thin, but it doesn't matter, because ultimately, and people have it in their brain that Israel, with 1/35 the population, 1/50th the GDP of the United States, somehow magically controls the U.S. When the U.S. arms industry alone spends more on lobbying Washington than AIPAC ever will. And there's many more industries than that exert influence over Washington. People have to, again, you have to understand the problem if you want to really solve it. But that, I think it's a good question. But no, I mean, Israel's going to, you can already see what they're doing. They're flanking Hezbollah's positions in southern Lebanon. They're going up along the border to the Litani River, where they were never before able to reach, and then they're going to flank Hezbollah. That's what's going on in Syria right now with the Israeli army.
Totally. And how I see it similarly. Israel Israel will continue to do what Israel does, especially now in this moment of opportunity with Syria completely in tatters and really on the chopping block. But I think in the medium and long term, what we're going to see is this overall picture that Israel as a U.S. kind of military outpost, it is getting, this is the thing about the U.S. empire as well. The more you spread out, the more you actually do become overstretched. In my opinion, I don't think Israel was ever designed to, as a settler, whatever we want to call it, regime, to expand into a greater Israel. That's the goal. But whether that is possible or not, whether that is actually going to be sustainable or not, is a different question, because you have so many factors. It was just before Syria fell where we were talking about, well, Israel actually is kind of mired in many fronts. It does have, the Western media talks about how they have this kind of itty bitty puny military that, if things continue to go on in a long kind of war, then it's going to be in trouble. But the United States is there to save Israel every single time, because the United States sees it. And I disagree with those who say that 100%. I hear people I respect say this, and they say Netanyahu is using the United States. Israel is using the United States. I actually don't agree with that assessment at all, because I think that negates U.S. foreign policy that predates Israel. The United States was looking to reshape the Middle East right after the European powers basically destroyed themselves during World War II. It was already looking at the Middle East and saying, wow, that's a great place to begin to assert dominance. And that's what they began to do on a covert basis. And that's ended up beginning in a lot of people beginning in 79 and onward started to do in a much more intense basis. But the United States was involved in part in Mossadegh's overthrow in 1953. So to believe that the United States needs Israel to have interests in West Asia and the Middle East is absolutely ridiculous. Biden himself said we would have to create an Israel for us in order to do what the United States wants to do as an empire, which is to dominate, exploit the resources, obtain geopolitical dominance, all of these things. But nonetheless, Israel, this is a kind of short-term reprieve for what is going to be, as we said in this show. I think the situation in Syria is going to devolve into such utter chaos for everybody involved. You cannot avoid. Chaos is great to achieve an objective like regime change. After regime change, chaos can become an agent of the opposite of what you're trying to achieve, which is some semblance of stability, so you can maintain a presence, so you can grab your booty, you can plunder the country, and you can plunder the region, and you can do that on a consistent basis. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know. Your last words on that, Brian. I don't think that's going to happen at all. I'm just looking at the forces they've just propped up. I'm looking at the regional situation. I'm looking at Turkey and Israel doing this now as they're, in the United States under Trump is going to have an aggressive posture in the Middle East. And there's no way a Donald Trump is going to say, yeah, the Middle East is, that can be Turkey and Israel's thing now. No way. This could devolve into, I'm just going to say this, Brian, it could devolve into an almost like imperial conflict, not maybe kinetically, but I think we're going to see a lot of disagreements over how this big landmass of Syria is run. Your final thoughts?
Well, I agree with that to a certain extent. If you look at the promised realms the U.S. offers its various proxies, if you actually look at the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey's promised realms all overlap with one another. So they did that on purpose. This is Empire 101. You divide and conquer. You always keep your proxies weak and off balance by even if it's just potential conflict with, or even if it's in the back of their mind that, I thought we were supposed to get that. Why are they getting that? So there is that. But the one thing I will say is you have this army of terrorists in Syria. The U.S. doesn't care about building up Syria. They don't want to build up Syria. They want it as a breeding ground to take all of this extremism and channel it toward the next direction. That is exactly where it's all going to go. And that's going to give an opportunity for other forces to kind of reassert themselves in Syria, which is exactly what happened in Libya. They used Libya to export terrorism. They had no interest in building it up, which created a vacuum that allowed others to move in. This is what will happen in Syria. So you have Turkey and Israel moving in, but they can only do that to a certain extent. They're not capable of absorbing all of Syria. And so what people have to worry about is where these terrorists are going next. I saw someone in the comments say, Jelani said they're going to go to Jerusalem next. Well, even if Jelani was that dumb,
they're not.
And he's like, let's go to Jerusalem. NATO would just pull the plug on their funding and their money, and they would evaporate. They would evaporate in the desert like
no more $2,000 a month. Yeah, no more $2,000.
Exactly. They're only going to get that money and those weapons if they keep going in the direction their CIA handlers tell them to go. That was always the deal. And when different small factions get it in their mind that this is actually somehow some kind of jihad, the U.S. comes with a B-52 or an A-10 and strafes them or bombs them. And that's how this is how it's like a mad dog, and the U.S. has like a choke leash and is like yanking on it to get it to go in the direction they want it. And the mad dog is a mad dog, does what it does, but ultimately, who's holding the leash? And that's all that matters.
And it's perpetual, Brian. This is why it drives me nuts to think that people actually believe, because of what happened in Syria, the United States suddenly is going to wash its hands of the situation because its so-called allies, even though you could argue that Turkey may not be a full ally of the United States, given that the United States has often backed Erdogan's opposition. But nonetheless, in my estimation, with all of these groups there, exactly what you said is going to transpire. First of all, these groups, HTS, whoever, whatever, the assortment 37 plus, they are not going to attack Israel. How many years do we need of this kind of proxy war, whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria? They have never so much as looked at Israel unless they're going there to get medical care. Like, that is the only time why is that? Well, because Israel is one of their patrons. That is who has supported them, because these forces are not about sectarianism or jihad. They use that as a smokescreen to employ their overall objectives, which to them is just grab everything, get everything that they want from their patrons, from their masters. They actually don't have anything else. But what ends up happening is they become their own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and they eventually actually do oftentimes turn on their masters, because they get really big. This is what happens with Israel too. Israel starts pulling on the US leash because they're really big. They have a lot of leverage. Doesn't mean that they control the United States, but they have leverage. Why do they have leverage? Well, they're a military beachhead in one of the most richest and valuable regions for the US empire. And now you have these ridiculously head chopping forces running around serving a similar purpose. And so they have leverage. So they begin to turn. They begin to get a little greedy. I think it's going to be this self-perpetuating thing where the United States is not going to pull out of Syria. It's going to have to. I think it's going to feel like it needs to step up its operations. It's going to conduct what we've seen in Iraq and other places, these military operations to fight terrorism, because that helps perpetuate this overall strategy of chaos and leading into what they really want, which is a roadmap to regime change in Iran. It helps them build up that kind of military capacity, which to me looks like it might expand. And yes, that is frightening. That is horrific, but it is, I think, in the final analysis, the real most logical outcome of what just happened.
Yes, the U.S. is only going to withdraw from any particular place because it is to an extent overextended, and if it has a major operation it's preparing for. So when they left Afghanistan, I suspect that was because they had been, again, for years, and since 2014, they were planning a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. They needed to concentrate resources there. They simply could not maintain both. If they ever were to leave the Middle East, it would be almost certainly because they're preparing for all-out war with Russia and Ukraine, or war with China in the Asia Pacific, or maybe both. Who knows at this point? But no, they're not going to voluntarily give up. That's not how this works. Everyone acts as if the U.S. is reacting to what's happening in the Middle East. The U.S. is driving everything that is happening in the Middle East. It is the modern day global empire of our time. And so everything happening there is happening because the US wants it to happen, because they're involved there and making it happen. Whether it's unfolding in the way they want or not, that is another question, but they are the ones driving all of it. So when President-elect Donald Trump said, I don't think we should get involved in Syria, this is your proxy war. These are your terrorists that you yourself were
He's
arming
signed
and
the Caesar
backing.
sanctions. That's ridiculous.
Yes.
Don't get
Yes.
involved. That's just starve the whole country. Like,
Yes,
it's
exactly.
ridiculous.
And for people who believe that Trump is going to somehow change things for America, I mean, that is the blinders that they have on. They're not looking at that. They're just looking at what a politician who has a proclivity to lie. They're just listening to the lies, and they're ignoring everything he has actually done all during his first term, and everything he's actually obviously openly setting up to do. Again, the people he has surrounded himself with are the exact same kind of people who aided and abetted everything the U.S. was doing all during his first term in office. People, I get it. They want to hope. They want things to change desperately, but just hoping in someone else to do it instead of you yourself getting involved in doing it, that is a mistake, and you're going to be disappointed every single time. Which is why I complain about information space as a national security domain. I only do alternative media because of that, because it's not being done.
Right.
Otherwise, there's a million other things I would rather do, and my blood pressure would rather me be doing with my time and energy. So we have to all think about what we can do to contribute toward this, instead of just placing our hope into someone else and hoping they do it, because they're not going to, especially a U.S. politician.
Yeah, and stop blaming all the forces that are trying to do something about it. This is just, whenever things go badly, it's important to understand that it doesn't mean that suddenly we should just burn everything that we've once known just because something has gone badly. What it means is that, no, we actually have to double down and continue forward with the principles. I think that's what the multipolar world is going to continue to do. It's going to continue to adhere by the principles of its project. And to me, that's what is most important. That is how you overcome odds like we see with what happened in Syria. It was a horrible tragedy. It is something that is indeed a setback. We cannot tiptoe around that. But in the final analysis, what this is really all about is staying on a course toward a multipolar world that will eventually get to the point to be able to do all of the things that people want of Russia and China right now. You have to build up to that. That's what Russia and China are doing. And we also have to understand, and I'll just close here, Brian, that the U.S. empire is in decay still. People need to stop with this revivalist, everything is great now for the empire. One victory. Actually, we've seen a string of victories. The United States overthrew Saddam Hussein and destroyed Iraq. They destroyed Afghanistan. They had a string of victories all throughout the 21st century. Ever since the Soviet Union fell, they've had one victory after another. But yet, the U.S. empire is still decaying as a force of dominance because it has a lot of economic contradictions. It also has this problem of, well, the more you destroy, the more people want to build something different. And so this is something that's not going to go away. These are problems that just don't go poof just because Syria was overthrown. So, for me, the fall of the Syrian government was I felt this way about Libya too, but I wasn't nearly as involved as I am now. Didn't nearly understand things as well. And, I worked really hard with Syrian Americans from back home who were supportive of their government during the most intense period where we thought the Obama administration was going to bomb to smithereens the entire country. So this is a particular hit for me personally and emotionally, but I'm not going to just change my tune and say everyone's a sellout. Iran sold out Syria, China sold out Syria, Russia sold out Syria, just because something went badly. We need to continue to investigate, look at what actually happened. We have a lot more information now, but there's still a lot of information we don't have. It'll all come out. But I think what we're going to find is that the situation was obviously more complex than what we've been told by this misinformation apparatus from the beginning. But Brian, any last thoughts? And then we will head out of here together. Any last thoughts before we go?
Well, I agree with that. I think that anything in life worth pursuing has its ups and downs and requires sacrifice. And if you're involved in something in life that does not, then maybe you're doing it wrong. And I think everyone's personal experience, I think they realize that. And if that's the case for all of us on an individual basis, it surely applies to a global project like multipolarism. You're absolutely right. The U.S. has had nothing but military victories in a certain sense. They're very good at destroying countries. They have a long list of countries they have destroyed in the 21st century. Syria is just the latest. But you're absolutely right. In the bigger picture, there is a fundamental shift, and the U.S. is in terminal decline. They're trying to do this to reassert themselves. They're trying to do this to stave it off, to buy time. A lot of them are even saying that a lot of this isn't to turn the tide, but to just buy time until they can think of a way to turn the tide. But at the end of the day, yes, we all just have to continue committing. If this is something you believe in based on principles, then you need to overcome your emotions. And again, you see this in your everyday life with other people. They have a setback and they allow it to derail their entire life. You see other people who, no matter how many times they fail, they continue. And those people, eventually they will find success. And the same is going to go for any international project. So that's what we will all do, our small part in an attempt to do this. And then I just want to thank you again, Danny, for having me on so that we can talk about this and help with our contribution, help people understand what is going on, and if you're interested in supporting multipolarism, what you could possibly do to do so.
Yes. Well, everybody, we are going to head out of here. Thanks so much, Brian, for joining me today. Everyone, go to the video description before you go, and be sure to check out the new Atlas. It's a great channel. It is Brian's, work on all of these questions that we talked about today. You can find so much more there. Then go to the video description as well to find all the links to support this channel, Patreon, Substack, and so many more. But for free, and I think it's really important, hit the like button. Be sure you do that and leave a comment. All of those things help boost this stream through the algorithm and the so-called replay. And then you get this conversation out there to so many more people well after it ends. With all that said, everybody, I will announce when I am back again soon. It's going to be a little bit of a break. It won't be as intense as it's been. It's been a really ridiculous time in history, a really intense time in history. But I will let you know when that happens next week. Without further ado, everyone, thanks so much and take care. Be back soon. Bye-bye.